In the year 1543, on his deathbed, a Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus finally held the printed pages of a book that would tear the Earth from the center of the universe. Buried inside its dense geometry was a mathematical trick so specific, so unusual, that centuries later, historians would trace it back through translated manuscripts, through Byzantine scholars, through Arabic observatories, to a single Persian mind who had died nearly 300 years earlier in the ashes of a burning empire. His name was Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, and this is the story historians did not fully piece together until modern times, the story of the man who may have quietly handed Copernicus the key to the solar system without ever being thanked for it. Stay with me, because what happens next is unbelievable. A boy raised inside a fortress of Islamic law, a prisoner inside a mountain stronghold guarded by assassins, an advisor standing beside the very warlord who burned the greatest library on Earth. A man who used the ashes of one civilization to build the most advanced observatory the world had ever seen. This is not a lecture. This is the story of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. He was born on the 18th of February in the year 1201 in the city of Tus, tucked into the Khorasan region of what is now northeastern Iran. The full name given to him at birth was Muhammad ibn al-Hassan al-Tusi, a name that would later be swallowed by the honorific history remembers him by, Nasir al-Din, defender of the faith. But in 1201, he was simply a child born into a family of 12 Shia scholars, in a city famous for producing some of the sharpest legal and philosophical minds in the Islamic world. His father was a jurist, trained in the 12th Imam school of Shiite law, a man who valued the discipline of the mind as much as the discipline of faith. Some historians describe him personally guiding young Tusi's earliest education, introducing him to the Quran, to Hadith, to jurisprudence, before mathematics ever entered the picture. Other accounts, drawing on al-Tusi's own fragmentary autobiography, suggest his father died while Tusi was still young, leaving an uncle to carry forward his intellectual formation, teaching him logic, physics, and metaphysics, while other tutors handled the language of numbers. What is not disputed is this. From his earliest years, young Tusi was raised inside a household that treated the pursuit of knowledge as something close to sacred. Of his mother, of siblings, of the rest of his family circle, history has kept almost total silence, a silence that, in itself, tells you something about how thoroughly the chaos about to arrive would erase entire genealogies from the record. Because this child was not born into peace. He was born into the opening years of the 13th century, a century that would watch a Mongol horde tear across Asia like a wound that never closed. Genghis Khan had already begun his campaigns far to the east, and by the time al-Tusi was a teenager, that storm was creeping toward his home. But first, there was Nishapur. As a young man, al-Tusi left Tus for this legendary center of learning, a city so rich in scholarship that it had produced some of the greatest minds of the Islamic Golden Age. There, he studied philosophy, medicine, and advanced mathematics, learning trigonometry under Kamal al-Din ibn Yunus, and immersing himself in logic under scholars trained in the tradition of Avicenna himself. He is even said to have crossed paths with Attar of Nishapur, the great Sufi poet, a man who would later be killed by the very Mongol wave al-Tusi was racing to outrun. By his early 20s, al-Tusi had become something rare, a mathematician, a philosopher, and a theologian all at once, fluent in the geometry of Euclid and the metaphysics of Avicenna in the same breath. He should have been on his way to becoming one more brilliant name inside the golden libraries of Persia. But what happened next would trap him for nearly 3 decades inside one of the strangest chapters in Islamic history. Here is where the curiosity gap opens, and I need you to sit with it for a moment. Around 1227, as the Mongol threat pressed further into Khorasan, al-Tusi accepted an offer of protection from an unlikely source. The Ismaili governor of Kuhistan, a man connected to the secretive Nizari Ismaili state, the very group history would come to know by a far more sinister nickname, the Assassins. What began as a shelter from the storm became, within a few years, something closer to a gilded cage. By around 1236, al-Tusi was living inside Alamut, the legendary mountain fortress that served as the beating heart of the Nizari Ismaili state. If you're new here, this is the part of history most people never learn in school, and it's about to get darker. Subscribe now, because the fall of this fortress is about to collide with one of the most devastating events in human history, and al-Tusi is standing directly in its path. Historians still debate exactly how free al-Tusi truly was inside Alamut. Some describe him as an honored guest, given access to one of the richest libraries in the Islamic world, free to write, calculate, and theorize in relative safety while the Mongol storm raged outside the fortress walls. Others describe something closer to captivity, a brilliant mind held hostage by a regime that understood exactly how valuable his intellect was and had no intention of letting him walk away. What we do know is that during those nearly 30 years, al-Tusi produced an extraordinary body of work. He composed treatises on ethics, including the Akhlaq-i Nasiri, dedicated to his Ismaili patron. He wrote on Twelver Shiite theology even while embedded in an Ismaili court, a philosophical tightrope walk that would follow him for the rest of his life. He studied the astronomical models of Ptolemy with a level of scrutiny no one had applied in centuries, quietly noting the flaws, the contradictions, the mathematical inconsistencies buried inside a system the entire world had accepted as truth for over 1,000 years. He was, in other words, sharpening a blade inside a mountain fortress, and he had no idea that the hand that would eventually wield it belonged to the very army bearing down on his homeland. By 1256, that army arrived at the gates of Alamut itself. The commander was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, leading one of the most devastating military campaigns the medieval world had ever witnessed. His mission: erase the Nizari Ismaili state from existence. Fortress by fortress, the Mongols dismantled 2 centuries of Ismaili power. And when Alamut itself finally fell, something happened that would alter the entire trajectory of al-Tusi's life. And, quietly, the trajectory of science itself. Instead of being executed alongside the fortress's defenders, al-Tusi was spared. Why would a Mongol conqueror, fresh from slaughtering an entire religious state, choose to protect a Persian scholar-theologian who had spent 30 years inside the enemy's walls? The most widely accepted explanation is almost unbearably practical. Hulagu Khan needed astrologers. In Mongol court culture, the movements of the stars dictated the timing of wars, the fate of campaigns, the very legitimacy of conquest. Al-Tusi wasn't just a scholar. He was, in Hulagu's eyes, a weapon of prediction. And so, rather than dying inside a burning fortress, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi walked out of Alamut as an advisor to the very warlord who had just annihilated his former protectors. Some historians have not been kind to this transition. Accusations of opportunism have followed al-Tusi for centuries, the idea that he simply pledged loyalty to whoever held the sword. Others argue this reading is unfair, a modern judgment applied to a medieval survival calculation in an age when entire cities were being erased overnight, and switching allegiance was often the only thing standing between a scholar and a mass grave. What is certain is this: al-Tusi made a choice, and that choice would place him at the side of Hulagu Khan for one of the single most catastrophic events in the history of civilization. In 1258, the Mongol army marched on Baghdad. For over 500 years, Baghdad had stood as the intellectual capital of the Islamic world, home to the House of Wisdom, a library and translation academy so vast it was said to hold the accumulated knowledge of Persia, Greece, India, and the ancient world combined. When the city fell, the destruction was almost apocalyptic. Historical accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from the thousands of manuscripts hurled into its waters, and red with the blood of a population slaughtered in the hundreds of thousands. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world for half a millennium, ended in a single brutal campaign. And Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was there. Historians believe he played some advisory role during the campaign, though the precise nature and extent of his influence over Hulagu's decisions remains genuinely disputed and cannot be stated with certainty. What is far better documented is what happened in the years immediately after the smoke cleared, because out of the single greatest intellectual catastrophe the medieval world had ever seen, al-Tusi began building something extraordinary. He asked Hulagu Khan for an observatory. Think about the audacity of that request. A city that held the greatest library on the planet had just been reduced to ash and floating ink. And in the ruins of that catastrophe, a Persian scholar looked at the most feared warlord in Asia and asked for money, land, and imperial protection. Not for a palace, not for gold, but for a building dedicated entirely to watching the sky. Hulagu said yes. In 1259, construction began on what would become the Maragha Observatory, built in the highlands west of the city of Maragha, in what is now northwestern Iran. It was unlike anything the world had seen before. This was not a single telescope on a rooftop. Telescopes as we know them wouldn't even exist for another 3.5 centuries. This was a sprawling scientific campus, stretching roughly 150 meters wide and 350 meters long, complete with a library eventually said to house as many as 40,000 volumes. Many of them salvaged and gathered from the very libraries the Mongols had plundered across Persia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. There was even a dome engineered to allow sunlight to pass through in a controlled way, letting astronomers track solar movement with remarkable precision for the era. Al-Tusi didn't just build a building, he built an institution, funded through a waqf, a permanent religious endowment, which meant the observatory could continue operating on its own resources long after its founder was gone. And it did. Maragha remained active for more than 50 years, drawing astronomers not only from across the Persian and Arab world, but from Syria, from Anatolia, and, remarkably, from China, whose astronomical computation methods were absorbed directly into the observatory's work. Some sources suggest over 100 students studied under al-Tusi at Maragha at its height. This was not a lone genius working in isolation. This was one of the first true international scientific research institutions in recorded history. But what he discovered inside those walls would quietly change the future of science forever. For over 1,000 years, the reigning model of the universe had come from a Greco-Roman astronomer named Claudius Ptolemy. In Ptolemy's system, the Earth sat motionless at the center of everything, while the sun, moon, and planets moved around it in a tangled web of circles and subcircles. There was a particularly troublesome piece of Ptolemy's math called the equant, a strange, almost cheating geometric device that made the planets appear to move at consistent, elegant speeds only if you observed them from a mathematically convenient point that wasn't the actual center of their orbit. It worked, in the sense that it predicted planetary positions with reasonable accuracy, but it violated the deep philosophical principle that had underpinned astronomy since antiquity, that celestial motion should be uniform, circular, and pure. Al-Tusi hated the equant. He considered it a mathematical fiction disguising a physical impossibility. Planets simply could not be moving at inconsistent speeds around true circles, not if the heavens were meant to embody the perfection ancient philosophy demanded of them. And so, working through the observations and calculations gathered at Maragha, Al-Tusi devised a solution so elegant it would ripple across cultures and centuries. It is now known as the Tusi Couple. Here is the idea, stripped down to its purest form. Take a small circle and roll it around the inside of a larger circle, exactly twice its size. If you track a single point on the edge of that smaller circle as it rolls, something almost magical happens. That point doesn't trace a curve at all. It moves in a perfectly straight line, oscillating back and forth along the diameter of the larger circle. Al-Tusi realized that by combining two circular motions in precisely this way, he could reproduce the linear, back-and-forth motion astronomers were observing in the planets, without ever needing Ptolemy's controversial equant, and without abandoning the ancient insistence on uniform circular motion. It was a way to have mathematical honesty and philosophical purity at the same time. It was, in essence, a way to make the heavens make sense again. He didn't stop there. Working alongside colleagues at Maragha, astronomers like Mo'ayyeduddin Urdi and Qutb-al-Din al-Shirazi, al-Tusi, helped compile one of the most accurate astronomical tables of the medieval world, the Zij-i-Ilkhani, dedicated to the Ilkhanid dynasty Hulagu had established. He advanced spherical trigonometry into something close to an independent mathematical discipline, separate from astronomy for the first time. He wrote critiques of Ptolemaic astronomy, so thorough and so mathematically rigorous that later scholars would call his work one of the most serious scientific challenges to the Ptolemaic system before the scientific revolution. And then, for nearly 300 years, his name went quiet in the West. Here is where the story takes the turn almost nobody expects. In 1543, Nicolaus Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, the book that would eventually convince the world the Earth revolves around the Sun. But buried inside its pages, describing the motion of Mercury, is a geometric diagram that mathematicians and historians of science would later stare at in disbelief. It is almost stroke for stroke the Tusi Couple. How could a Polish astronomer working in the 16th century have reproduced, with startling precision, a mathematical device invented by a Persian scholar in a Mongol-funded observatory 3 centuries earlier? Copernicus never cited al-Tusi. There is no smoking gun letter, no signed confession, no definitive paper trail proving direct transmission. And to be clear, historians urge caution here. The exact chain connecting Maragha to Krakow has never been fully confirmed, and reputable scholars continue to debate precisely how the idea traveled. But the leading theory, supported by careful manuscript research, points toward Byzantine Greek translations of Arabic astronomical texts circulating through scholarly networks in Italy during Copernicus's education there. Networks where the mathematics of Maragha, even if the name Tusi had been stripped away in transmission, could plausibly have reached a curious young astronomer piecing together an entirely new model of the cosmos. If that theory is correct, then a device built by a Persian scholar working under the patronage of the very Mongol dynasty that burned Baghdad may have quietly supplied one of the essential mathematical tools behind the Copernican Revolution, the single most important shift in the history of astronomy. A Persian genius may have helped dismantle a 1,000-year-old worldview, and almost no one outside specialist circles knew his name. If you're finding this as astonishing as I did when I first researched it, make sure you're subscribed, because we are not done. Al-Tusi's story has one more layer, and it's the most human part of all. Because behind the equations and the observatories was a man wrestling with contradictions that never fully resolved. He had spent 30 years writing Ismaili theology inside Alamut, then pivoted, once free, back toward Twelver Shiite doctrine, producing works like Tajrid al-Iqtiqad that would go on to shape Shiite theological thought for centuries. Was this conviction or survival? Historians remain divided, and al-Tusi himself, in his own sparse autobiographical writing, gives few clean answers. He served the men who annihilated his former patrons and helped erase the intellectual heart of his own civilization. And in the same breath, he used his position beside them to rebuild something that would outlast every one of their military conquests. He was, in the truest sense, a man of paradox, a theologian who trusted mathematics, a survivor who became an architect, a scholar who turned catastrophe into one of the greatest scientific institutions of the medieval world. Of his personal life beyond scholarship and survival, his wife, his children, the quiet moments outside the observatory walls, history has left us remarkably little. What fragments exist are thin enough that responsible historians simply do not claim to know. Perhaps that, too, is part of who he was. A man so consumed by the project of understanding the universe that almost nothing of his private world survived to be studied. Al-Tusi remained at Maragha through the reign of Hulagu Khan and into the regency of his successor, Maragha Khan, continuing to write, calculate, and mentor students well into his final years. In 1274, while traveling in Baghdad, the same city he had entered decades earlier in the company of its conquerors, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi died. He was laid to rest near the shrine of Musa al-Qadim in the Qadimiyya district, a resting place chosen fittingly in the city whose destruction had once handed him the opportunity of his life's greatest work. He left behind more than 150 known works, spanning mathematics, astronomy, ethics, theology, logic, and even early explorations of biology and mechanics. He left behind Maragha, an institution that would continue operating for half a century after his death and would directly inspire later observatories across the Islamic world, including the Great Observatory at Samarkand, built by the astronomer Prince Ulugh Beg. And, if the historians tracing that quiet mathematical thread are right, he left behind a single elegant geometric idea that helped a Polish astronomer, 3 centuries later and a continent away, finally convince the world that the Earth was not the center of everything. There is something almost unbearably poetic about that legacy. A man who spent his life proving that the heavens did not need to lie to make sense, using a mathematics built from honesty instead of convenient fiction, ended up handing that same honesty forward, hand to hand, culture to culture, until it reached the man who would finally move the earth itself. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi never saw the Copernican Revolution. He never knew his geometry would help unseat the very cosmos he spent his life trying to understand. But perhaps that is the truest measure of genius. Not the recognition it receives in its own century, but the quiet, untraceable ways it keeps reshaping the world long after the mind that created it has gone still. If this story moved you the way it moved me while researching it, subscribe and stay close, because history is full of minds like this one, brilliant people erased by time, waiting to be found again. Thank you for watching.